The Pelican Brief. Two Supreme Court justices are murdered on the same night, and almost immediately, Washington begins behaving as though the deaths are not merely a tragedy, but a warning. The victims are not ordinary judges. They sit at the highest level of American law, where a single decision can change the direction of an entire nation. Their assassination should produce clarity, outrage, investigation. Instead, they produce fear, secrecy, and a frantic search for whoever might have wanted them gone. And the most disturbing part is that the people responsible do not seem particularly interested in hiding the fact that powerful people can be killed. They are interested in hiding why. That distinction is everything. Because the Pelican Brief is not really about two murders. It is about what happens when someone discovers the connection between them. That someone is Darby Shaw, a brilliant Tulane law student whose greatest weapon is also the thing that places her life in immediate danger: her ability to see patterns. Darby approaches the assassinations like an academic problem. She studies the justices, examines their judicial histories, researches controversial cases, and searches through the details that most people would dismiss as unrelated. Her investigation is not backed by a government agency or a newspaper. It is simply the work of an intelligent young woman trying to understand something that does not make sense. Eventually, she produces a legal theory explaining why the two justices may have been targeted. She calls it the Pelican Brief. On the surface, it is exactly what a law professor might expect from a talented student. An argument, a hypothesis, an intellectual exercise. But the film transforms that harmless academic document into something almost radioactive. The moment other people begin reading it, Darby's life changes. Her professor and lover Thomas Callahan recognizes the potential significance of her theory and shares it with people he trusts. From there, the document moves upward through the machinery of government. And with every person who reads it, the danger becomes more real. Darby has unknowingly crossed the invisible boundary between knowing something and knowing too much. Her theory points toward powerful interests, corporate money, environmental politics, and the possibility that the assassinations were designed to clear a path for a massive development scheme. Suddenly, the question is no longer whether her theory is academically impressive. The question is whether she is correct enough to become a threat. That is where the film changes genre. What begins as a legal mystery becomes a survival story. Darby is no longer sitting safely in a classroom surrounded by books. She is watching people around her disappear. She is learning that telephones can carry threats, strangers can be assassins, and institutions can have motives of their own. The ordinary rules of trust collapse one by one, and Pakula makes the transition especially frightening, because Darby never becomes a superhero. She remains vulnerable. She is frightened, isolated, and constantly forced to make decisions without knowing whether the person standing in front of her is an ally or another part of the trap. Her intelligence keeps her alive, but intelligence alone cannot stop a bullet. This creates the central tension of the film. The truth may be powerful, but the person carrying it is fragile. The conspiracy does not fear Darby because she can physically defeat anyone. It fears her because she has written down an explanation that could connect powerful people to murder. Information becomes a weapon, but unlike a gun, information cannot be controlled once it escapes. One person reads it, then another, then another. The people trying to silence Darby therefore face a problem that violence cannot completely solve. They can eliminate a witness, but they cannot guarantee that the witness has not already told someone else. They can destroy a document, but they cannot erase the idea inside it. and they can threaten a journalist, but they cannot completely control what happens once the press decides the story is real. This is why the film's central fear feels larger than the conspiracy itself. It is the fear that truth can become an existential threat to authority. The institutions that should protect citizens may instead protect themselves. The people who appear to represent stability may be terrified of exposure. The law, which Darby has spent years studying as a system of rules and principles, suddenly becomes something more complicated. A battlefield where competing interests fight over who gets to define reality. And once Darby understands that, there is no going back. Her brief has stopped being a school assignment. It has become a death sentence. But to understand why the Pelican brief carries so much weight, we have to look beyond its plot. Alan J. Pakula did not arrive at this story as an ordinary studio director simply adapting another best-selling legal thriller. He had spent decades developing a cinematic language built around suspicion, hidden structures, political manipulation, and people trying to understand forces larger than themselves. Films such as Clute, The Parallax View, and All the President's Men had established a particular kind of Pakula paranoia, one where the most frightening threat was often not the person holding the weapon but the institution behind the person holding it. The Pelican brief arrives in the early 1990s with a very different commercial package. It has Julia Roberts, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, and Denzel Washington, whose screen presence carries an entirely different kind of authority. It has the recognizable name of John Grisham behind the source material. It has the scale, locations, action sequences, and marketing power of a major studio release. Yet underneath that glossy exterior, Pakula is still asking the same questions he had been asking for years. Who controls information? Who benefits when the truth remains hidden? And what happens to an individual who discovers that the system surrounding them may be compromised? That is the analytical journey this film invites us to take. First, the story has to be understood as a carefully constructed machine of escalating information. Every clue changes the meaning of the previous clue. Every answer produces another question. Darby begins with 2 dead justices and ends up confronting a network that reaches from corporate wealth into the highest levels of government. Then the film's production history becomes part of the story, because Grisham's literary popularity created an expectation of fast-moving commercial entertainment, while Pakula brought the instincts of a filmmaker who understood that paranoia works best when the audience is made to feel watched. From there, the performances become essential. Julia Roberts does not play Darby as an action hero. She plays her as a woman whose intelligence is gradually reshaped by trauma. Denzel Washington's Grey Grantham is not simply there to rescue her. He represents the press as a competing institution, one that can become dangerous to power precisely because it can turn private information into public knowledge. Their partnership is therefore more important than a conventional romance would have been. The film is interested in trust before intimacy. It is interested in whether 2 people with very different reasons for pursuing the truth can protect one another long enough to expose it. We will also examine Pakula's visual grammar. The long lenses, glass, shadows, empty spaces, reflections, corridors, windows, and frames within frames that make characters appear trapped even when they are standing in open environments. We will look at James Horner's score and the way it creates anxiety without constantly announcing danger. We will examine the sound design, the practical filmmaking, the political context of 1993, the reaction to the film, and the way its commercial success helped define an era when adult-oriented thrillers could still become mainstream events. And eventually we have to ask the uncomfortable question: How much of the Pelican brief still works now? Because the technology is dated. The investigative methods are almost quaint. People rely on payphones, physical files, newsroom archives, and face-to-face meetings in ways that feel increasingly distant from modern life. Yet the underlying fear is strangely intact. The tools of information have changed, but the struggle over information has not. In fact, if anything, the modern world has made the film's central anxiety easier to recognize. We live in an age of instantaneous information, algorithmic amplification, political polarization, corporate influence, and widespread institutional mistrust. The Pelican Brief could never have predicted every modern development, but it understood something fundamental. People become afraid when they can no longer determine who controls the truth. That is why this 1990s thriller deserves more than a nostalgic glance. It deserves to be examined as a film about an anxiety that never really went away. For viewers who grew up with 1990s cinema, The Pelican Brief also carries the unmistakable atmosphere of an era when legal thrillers could feel like event movies. John Grisham adaptations were everywhere, and audiences became comfortable with a very specific kind of cinematic protagonist. Lawyers, reporters, investigators, witnesses, and ordinary professionals who accidentally discovered extraordinary corruption. These characters were not trained soldiers. They did not have supernatural abilities. They survived through intelligence, persistence, and the ability to recognize when something was wrong. That is part of what makes Darby's journey so compelling. Her world feels tangible because information has a physical form. Research means opening files. Investigating means making phone calls. Journalism means talking to sources, reading documents, and moving information through a newsroom. A suspicious lead cannot simply be searched online. You have to find it. You have to verify it. You have to physically go somewhere. That slower process creates a unique kind of suspense because the audience understands that every delay can be fatal. When Darby needs information, she cannot instantly retrieve it. When she needs help, she cannot assume that the person answering the phone is safe. When she needs to disappear, there is no digital world she can simply shut down. Her physical presence is her vulnerability. That makes the film's paranoia unusually intimate. We are accustomed to modern stories in which characters can be tracked through phones, cameras, databases, and social media. In The Pelican Brief, the fear is more primitive. Someone may be standing across the street. Someone may be following the car. Someone may know which hotel room you are staying in. Someone may have already entered the room before you return. The enemy remains invisible, and that invisibility is what makes the threat psychologically overwhelming. Darby does not know exactly how large the conspiracy is. She only knows that the people who should be asking questions seem strangely interested in stopping them. The deeper she goes, the more isolated she becomes. That isolation is important because it prevents the film from becoming a simple puzzle-solving exercise. Darby is not merely trying to discover what happened. She is trying to maintain a sense of reality, while everyone around her becomes potentially unreliable. That is the emotional nightmare beneath the legal thriller. Imagine discovering something that could expose powerful people, then realizing that the people with the greatest ability to protect you may also have the greatest reason to silence you. That is the nightmare The Pelican Brief gives to its audience. And because the film never allows Darby to become completely comfortable, the viewer is forced to share her uncertainty. A ringing telephone becomes threatening. A hotel hallway becomes suspicious. A stranger's glance can suddenly feel like surveillance. A familiar face can become frightening because trust itself has become a liability. This is why the movie's nostalgia is more complicated than simply remembering old Hollywood. We may miss the typewriters, newspapers, payphones, physical files, and crowded newsrooms, but the deeper reason those objects feel so cinematic is that they belong to a world where information moved slowly enough for suspense to breathe. The audience had time to wonder. Characters had time to make mistakes. Investigators had time to follow the wrong lead. And conspirators had time to hide. The Pelican brief uses that slower world to create a particular emotional experience. The feeling of being hunted by something you cannot see. Darby is not simply running from a person. She is running from a system. She does not know where its boundaries end, and neither do we. Every time she finds a safe place, the film quietly reminds us that safety may only be temporary. Every time she finds an ally, the possibility of betrayal remains. And every time she discovers new evidence, the danger becomes greater. This is where the film establishes its emotional contract with the audience. We are not watching only to discover whether Darby's theory is correct. We are watching because we need her to survive long enough for the truth to matter. The mystery gives us curiosity, but the vulnerability gives us investment. That distinction is what turns a conspiracy into a story. We want answers, but more importantly, we want to know whether one person can force a system to acknowledge what it has tried to bury. That question takes us back to the film's origins, because the Pelican brief emerged at exactly the moment when John Grisham had become one of the most commercially powerful writers in America. Grisham's legal thrillers were perfectly suited to Hollywood. His stories combined recognizable professions, high-stakes moral conflicts, corporate power, government secrets, and protagonists who could be placed in immediate physical danger without becoming traditional action heroes. The firm had already demonstrated how effectively his storytelling could translate to the screen, turning a legal thriller into a major commercial success. The Pelican brief arrived in that environment with an enormous built-in audience and a premise that practically advertised itself as a movie. 2 Supreme Court justices murdered. A brilliant young law student discovers a possible connection. A powerful oil magnate may be involved. Government officials become nervous. A newspaper reporter begins investigating. The ingredients were already there. What Pakula brought to them was atmosphere. Rather than treating the material as merely another fast-paced thriller, he understood that the most frightening aspect of the story was not the assassinations themselves. It was the possibility that the assassinations were part of a structure. A random killer is frightening because of what he can do in a moment. An institution is frightening because of what it can do repeatedly, quietly, and with resources. That distinction sits at the heart of Pakula's filmmaking. In his paranoia films, the protagonist rarely understands the full shape of the threat. The audience is given enough information to feel that something enormous exists just beyond the frame, but not enough to make it completely visible. That technique translates surprisingly well to Grisham's material. The legal exposition could easily have become dry. Instead, Pakula uses the information itself as suspense. Every document carries potential danger. Every conversation might reveal another layer. Every person who knows the brief creates another possible point of exposure. The screenplay therefore has to perform 2 contradictory jobs. It must explain enough for the audience to understand the conspiracy, while withholding enough to preserve uncertainty. Too much explanation would destroy paranoia. Too little would create confusion. The film lives in that narrow space between the two. That balancing act becomes even more important because the studio had assembled an extraordinary cast. Julia Roberts was already one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars, carrying the kind of fame that could make a film commercially attractive before audiences even knew the plot. Her presence also created a useful contradiction. Roberts was associated with warmth, charisma, romance, and enormous screen appeal, while Darby Shaw's world is defined by fear, isolation, and mistrust. The film uses that contrast carefully. Darby may look like a traditional Hollywood heroine, but she is placed inside a story that refuses to protect her simply because she is the star. She gets frightened. She makes mistakes. She is forced to hide. She loses someone she loves. Her transformation is emotional rather than physical. Denzel Washington brought a different energy. Following the critical acclaim surrounding Malcolm X, Washington had demonstrated that he could command the screen through intelligence and moral authority, rather than conventional action star theatrics. Grey Grantham therefore becomes a natural counterpart to Darby. She discovers the truth accidentally and must learn how to survive it. He has chosen journalism as a profession and understands that information only becomes meaningful when it can be verified and published. Their partnership gives the film two different models of truth-seeking. Darby is the researcher. Grey is the investigator. She finds the pattern. He tests whether the pattern can withstand scrutiny. Together, they form something neither could create alone. That dynamic also explains why the film's decision to avoid turning their relationship into a conventional romance is so significant. Hollywood often assumes that two attractive leads must eventually become emotionally or romantically involved. Pakula instead keeps their connection centered on purpose. Their chemistry comes from mutual respect, shared danger, and intellectual compatibility. It makes the story feel less like a romance inserted into a thriller, and more like a thriller about two professionals discovering that trust can be more valuable than attraction. This was a major studio movie, but it still carries the instincts of a filmmaker who believed that tension comes from uncertainty. Pakula did not need to turn every scene into a chase. He could allow a conversation to breathe. He could hold a shot long enough for the audience to notice a distant figure. He could let a hallway feel threatening before anything actually happened. He understood that paranoia becomes less effective when everything is loud. Fear becomes stronger when the film occasionally becomes quiet. That approach created a creative tension at the heart of the adaptation. The studio needed a commercially accessible thriller, but Pakula wanted something more psychologically unsettling. The result is a movie that exists between two traditions. It has the polished surfaces of the 1990s blockbuster and the suspicious soul of the 1970s political thriller. That combination is not always perfectly balanced, but when it works, it gives the Pelican brief its distinctive identity. The cultural landscape surrounding the film's release made that identity especially relevant. America in the early 1990s was no longer living through the exact political circumstances that had produced Pakula's earlier paranoia films, but the distress those films expressed had not disappeared. Watergate remained a defining memory of institutional betrayal. The idea that government officials could lie, manipulate information, and abuse power was no longer a radical cinematic fantasy. It was part of the country's political memory. At the same time, the early 1990s brought new anxieties surrounding corporate influence, environmental regulation, lobbying, and the relationship between private wealth and public policy. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the Cold War had ended, and American culture was beginning to confront a different kind of uncertainty. The enemy was no longer necessarily a foreign ideological superpower. It could be a corporation, It could be a political network. It could be an alliance between private money and public authority. The Pelican Brief understands that transition almost intuitively. Its conspiracy is not built around a foreign invasion. It is built around domestic power. The threat comes from people who operate within the same institutions the audience has been taught to trust. That makes the film's paranoia more intimate. The Supreme Court, the White House, the FBI, the press, and corporate America all become pieces of the same ecosystem. None of these institutions is presented as uniformly evil, but the film repeatedly asks what happens when individual people inside them decide that preserving power is more important than preserving principle. That question was commercially useful in 1993 because audiences already understood the basic language of political suspicion. But Warner Brothers also had to sell the film as entertainment, not as a political lecture. The marketing therefore emphasized the stars, the mystery, the danger, and the scale. Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington became part of the movie's selling point. Their pairing suggested prestige and accessibility at the same time. Roberts brought enormous mainstream recognition. Washington brought dramatic credibility and intensity. Together they made the film feel like an event. The commercial expectation was clear. This was not supposed to be a small, obscure political thriller. It was supposed to be a major studio release capable of attracting audiences who wanted suspense without abandoning adult themes. That distinction matters when considering the film's later reputation. Some viewers remember The Pelican Brief as a classic 1990s thriller precisely because it occupies that middle ground. It is serious enough to engage with political ideas but accessible enough to function as entertainment. It asks audiences to think about corporate influence while still giving them assassins, escapes, explosions, and close calls. It turns constitutional anxiety into popcorn cinema without completely removing the anxiety. That was one of the great strengths of 1990s Hollywood. Studios could still spend significant money on films aimed primarily at adults without requiring every project to be built around a franchise. The Pelican Brief was based on a best-selling novel, but its success depended on the belief that audiences would show up for characters and ideas as well as spectacle. The Roberts-Washington pairing was central to that belief. There was an obvious curiosity surrounding two major stars sharing a film, but the movie structure resisted the easiest commercial assumption. Instead of building the campaign around romance, it sold the relationship as a partnership against an increasingly dangerous conspiracy. That choice made the film feel more mature than a conventional star vehicle. It also gave the story room to breathe. Darby does not need Gray to become her romantic savior. She needs someone who will believe her. And Gray does not need Darby to become his love interest. He needs a source he can trust and a story worth risking his career to publish. Their alliance becomes one of the film's quietest statements about institutional power. When systems fail, individuals have to create new networks of trust. A student and a reporter, neither of whom possesses the power of the people hunting them, become dangerous precisely because they combine their strengths. The studio could sell that as suspense. Pakula could use it as political commentary, and the audience could experience both simultaneously. Then the story begins in earnest, with two names that should represent the stability of American law suddenly becoming synonymous with murder. Justice Rosenberg is one of the first victims, followed by Justice Jensen, and the methodical precision of the killings immediately establishes the presence of a professional assassin. Kamel is not introduced as a theatrical villain who announces his intentions. He is frightening because he is efficient. He moves through the world as though human life is simply another logistical problem. His presence tells us something important about the conspiracy before we understand the conspiracy itself. Whoever ordered these murders has access to people who can act without hesitation. That means Darby's later discovery is not merely politically inconvenient. It is physically dangerous. Meanwhile, Darby Shaw is living in a completely different world. She is a law student, immersed in cases and legal theory, And her relationship with Thomas Callahan adds another layer to her academic life. Callahan is both professor and lover, creating a complicated dynamic in which Darby is intellectually confident, but emotionally connected to someone who occupies a position of authority over her. Their relationship is not the central romance of the film, but it matters because Callahan becomes the person who takes her theory seriously enough to help it leave the classroom. Darby is not satisfied with the obvious explanations surrounding the assassinations. She begins digging through records and judicial histories, searching for a common denominator. Her research is obsessive but methodical. She is not chasing a conspiracy because she enjoys conspiracy theories. She is testing a legal hypothesis. That distinction makes her eventual transformation more believable. She starts from evidence, not paranoia. The irony is that the evidence eventually gives her every reason to become paranoid. Her work leads her toward the idea that the two justices may have represented the final obstacle to a powerful development project involving environmental protections and land that is associated with the brown pelican. The bird itself gives the theory its memorable name, but the real significance lies beneath the symbol. The pelican represents a protected interest that powerful people want removed because it stands in the way of profit. Suddenly, environmental law, corporate ambition, judicial decisions, and political influence begin to overlap. Darby has discovered a possible motive for murder by following the consequences of a legal decision. That is exactly the kind of connection that would make a thriller writer excited, because the murder mystery is not separate from the political story. The murder is the political story. Elsewhere, investigative reporter Gray Grantham is working in the Washington Post newsroom, following his own leads and trying to understand the assassinations from a journalistic perspective. His world is filled with phones, editors, notes, sources, and the constant pressure to turn uncertainty into something publishable. Unlike Darby, Gray does not have the luxury of treating information as an academic exercise. If he prints something wrong, the consequences are public. His reputation is on the line. His sources can be endangered. His newspaper can be attacked. That professional responsibility becomes crucial later, because Gray cannot simply believe Darby. He has to verify her. And that creates a productive tension between them. Darby knows her theory. Gray knows how stories collapse when evidence is weak. She is convinced. He is cautious. She wants someone to listen. He needs proof. The film uses this difference to build credibility around the conspiracy. The audience is encouraged to believe Darby because she is intelligent, but we are also encouraged to trust Gray because he refuses to accept intelligence as evidence by itself. Their methods are different, but they point toward the same destination. And the deeper Darby digs, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. The two justices were not necessarily killed because of something they did in private. They may have been killed because of what they were about to decide in public. That is the moment when law becomes political warfare. The courtroom disappears from view, but its decisions continue to shape the actions of people outside it. A judicial ruling can cost a corporation billions. A protected species can delay a development project. A Supreme Court justice can become an obstacle to an enormous financial ambition. And suddenly, the murder of two judges no longer seems impossible. It becomes terrifyingly logical. The film's genius in this early movement is that it never asks the audience to believe that institutions are inherently evil. It asks us to consider how ordinary institutional incentives can become dangerous when enough money and power accumulate behind them. Darby's brief gives that danger a name. And once the name exists, someone has to make sure it disappears. Callahan becomes the bridge between Darby's private discovery and the wider political world. He knows enough about her argument to understand that it cannot simply remain an academic exercise. He contacts Gavin Verheek, an FBI official and old friend, trusting that the federal system will know how to evaluate a potentially explosive theory. But the brief does not remain contained. It moves upward, eventually reaching the White House and Chief of Staff Fletcher Cole. And this is where the film begins to show its most frightening institutional idea. Information does not become safer when it reaches people with more power. Sometimes it becomes more dangerous. The brief has traveled from a student to a professor, from a professor to an FBI contact, and from there into the highest political circles. Every transfer increases the possibility that someone will understand its implications. Darby believes she has written a theory. The people reading it may see an operational threat. If the theory is correct, then it identifies a motive, a beneficiary, and a potential connection between the murders and a corporate political agenda. That makes Darby an accidental threat to everyone invested in keeping the theory buried. The White House response is particularly important because Fletcher Cole represents the institutional instinct to contain damage. He is not presented as a cartoon villain screaming about power. His danger comes from calmness. He understands how systems protect themselves. When a problem threatens the administration, the first question becomes not necessarily whether the allegation is true, but how much exposure it could create. That is the beginning of the moral collapse at the center of the conspiracy. The machinery of government is being used not to discover the truth, but to manage the consequences of the truth. Meanwhile, Darby remains unaware of just how far her brief has traveled. She is still thinking like a law student. Callahan's decision to share the document has placed both of them in danger, but Darby cannot yet understand the scale of that danger. Then the car bomb changes everything. Callahan is killed in an explosion intended to eliminate both him and Darby, and the transformation is immediate. The man who had encouraged her intellectual curiosity is suddenly dead because of the information she created. For Darby, this is not merely a tragic loss. It is evidence. Her theory has consequences. Somebody has acted against her. The academic exercise has become reality. In a conventional legal thriller, this might be the moment when the heroine calls the authorities. But the Pelican brief has already established why that solution is complicated. The people inside the system may know about the conspiracy. Some of them may even be protecting it. Darby therefore has to make the most difficult decision of her life. Trust the system she has studied, or assume that the system itself may be compromised. She chooses survival. The change is visible in everything she does. She becomes more cautious, more suspicious, more willing to disappear. She changes her appearance, moves between locations, avoids predictable routines, and begins thinking several steps ahead. The woman who once investigated legal cases from a library table is now investigating her own surroundings for threats. New Orleans becomes part of this transformation because the city offers a different atmosphere from Washington's controlled corridors of power. Its crowded streets, noise, movement, and unpredictability can provide cover, but they can also hide danger. Darby realizes that being surrounded by people does not necessarily make her safer. An assassin only needs one opportunity. The city can become camouflage for both the hunted and the hunter. Kamel continues to move through the story like a shadow, reinforcing the idea that Darby's enemies are not limited by geography. They can find her wherever she goes. She has become a moving target because the information she possesses is more valuable than her identity. That is another crucial point. Darby is not being hunted because of who she is. She is being hunted because of what she knows. The distinction turns knowledge into a physical burden. She cannot simply give the brief away and return to normal life because the danger exists in the fact that she understands it. The more she knows, the more dangerous she becomes. And the more dangerous she becomes, the more desperately others want to control what she knows. Her relationship with Callahan's memory therefore becomes inseparable from her investigation. Finishing what he helped begin becomes a way of giving meaning to his death, but it also creates a trap. Every step toward the truth increases the chance that she will suffer the same fate. The film understands that courage is not the absence of fear. Darby is courageous because she continues while knowing exactly what the cost might be. She is not chasing justice from a position of strength. She is chasing it from a position of profound vulnerability. When Darby attempts to reconnect with Gavin Verheek, she believes she is reaching toward one of the few people who might still be able to help her. But by this point, the conspiracy has already reached him. Kamel murders Verheek and uses his identity to lure Darby into a meeting. The scene works because Darby enters it carrying two conflicting instincts. She desperately needs help, but she has also learned that trusting people can get them killed. The disguised meeting becomes a test of whether her instincts have developed quickly enough. Kamel's impersonation is chilling precisely because it weaponizes familiarity. Darby expects to meet someone she has reason to trust, and instead she finds herself sitting across from a professional killer. The danger is not immediately obvious. That delay is what makes the sequence effective. Paranoia thrives when the threat is hidden inside normality. Darby realizes something is wrong, and suddenly the scene collapses into violence. Kamel is unexpectedly shot by another operative, leaving Darby alive but even more confused. If the people hunting her can kill one another, then the conspiracy is larger and more fragmented than she imagined. There are competing interests, competing agendas, and people whose loyalties are impossible to map. That uncertainty pushes Darby toward Gray Grantham. She contacts the Washington Post reporter because she recognizes that the press may offer something the government cannot: an independent mechanism for turning information into public knowledge. But Gray does not simply accept her story. He listens, investigates, and begins testing the claims. Their partnership grows out of skepticism rather than blind trust. Darby gives him the hypothesis. Gray searches for the evidence. His investigation leads toward an anonymous source known as Garcia, a mysterious insider who may possess information capable of confirming Darby's theory. The search for Garcia introduces another layer of paranoia. The source is hidden. His identity is uncertain. His information has already endangered people. Every attempt to find him risks exposing both Darby and Gray. Yet the search is necessary because the difference between suspicion and journalism is verification. Gray understands that if the Post is going to publish a story accusing powerful people of orchestrating murders, they need evidence strong enough to withstand the consequences. That standard becomes the film's moral defense of journalism. The newspaper is not valuable simply because it can publish. It is valuable because responsible publication requires a process of testing claims. In a world where the government can deny allegations and corporations can hire lawyers, evidence becomes the only language that can force power to respond. Darby and Gray therefore create a partnership based on complementary skills. She understands the legal logic. He understands the journalistic process. She knows what the pattern means. He knows how to prove it. Meanwhile, surveillance intensifies. Darby begins to realize that even people who appear neutral may have connections to the conspiracy. The White House, intelligence agencies, corporate interests, and law enforcement become difficult to separate. The film deliberately avoids giving the audience a single villain controlling everything. Instead, it creates a network of people whose interests overlap. That makes the conspiracy feel more plausible on a psychological level, because corruption rarely requires every participant to know the entire plan. One person wants money, another wants political stability, another wants to protect an administration, another wants to avoid scandal, another is simply following orders. The system becomes dangerous because all those motivations can point in the same direction without requiring a single mastermind. Darby's greatest challenge is therefore not defeating one enemy. It is navigating a structure in which responsibility has been distributed so widely that nobody appears completely accountable. That is why the hunt for Garcia matters. A source inside the system could provide the missing link. Someone who understands the corporate side of the conspiracy could turn Darby's theory into documented fact. But finding that person means entering another layer of danger. The closer Darby and Gray get, the more the conspiracy responds. Their progress creates pressure. Their questions create fear. Their existence becomes evidence that the information is moving again. And the film keeps returning to the same fundamental idea. The truth is dangerous not because it is abstract, but because powerful people have something concrete to lose. Eventually, Garcia is identified as Curtis Morgan, a lawyer connected to the firm representing Victor Matisse. His death reveals just how far the conspiracy reaches. Morgan was not an outsider making wild accusations. He was close enough to the corporate machinery to know what was happening. His murder therefore becomes another piece of evidence, but it also illustrates the system's method. People who know too much are removed. Information is compartmentalized. The people at the center remain protected because the evidence against them is scattered across individuals who can be isolated, threatened, or killed. Darby and Gray discover that Morgan had left behind information capable of changing everything. The challenge is not simply finding the evidence. It is getting to it before the people protecting the conspiracy can destroy it. This is where the film's physical suspense becomes inseparable from its intellectual suspense. Earlier, the danger came from the possibility that Darby might be wrong. Now the danger comes from knowing that she may be right. The discovery of Morgan's hidden safe deposit box transforms the investigation into a race. Documents and recordings suddenly carry the weight of lives. The evidence is not glamorous. It is paper, tape, recorded testimony, fragments of correspondence. Yet in the world of the Pelican brief, those objects are more powerful than almost anything else because they can connect the conspiracy to the people who ordered it. The parking garage sequence captures the film's ability to turn ordinary architecture into a trap. Garages are designed for movement, but Pakula uses them as spaces of uncertainty. Concrete, shadows, repeating levels, limited visibility, and multiple exits that do not necessarily lead to safety. Darby and Gray are moving through a place that appears open but feels claustrophobic. The visual contradiction reflects the broader conspiracy. There are institutions everywhere, but access to the truth remains narrow. There are many exits but few trustworthy ones. The pursuit escalates because the conspiracy is no longer an abstract threat. Someone knows that Darby and Gray are close. Their investigation has become a race against people with the resources to stop them. And yet the investigators keep moving. The evidence they recover becomes the smoking gun that links Maddie's ambitions to the broader scheme. The legal theory Darby created in isolation now has documentary support. Her academic hypothesis has evolved into an investigative story. That evolution is one of the most satisfying structures in the film. The story begins with Darby believing that a pattern exists. Then she becomes hunted because someone else knows she sees it. Then Gray helps test it. Then Morgan's information provides evidence. Each stage transforms the same basic idea from theory into fact. That is also why the title becomes more meaningful as the story develops. The Pelican Brief is not merely a document. It represents the journey of information from private thought to public truth. At first, it exists only in Darby's mind. Then it becomes paper. Then it becomes a secret. Then it becomes evidence. Finally, it becomes a story that can no longer be contained. That progression is the film's real narrative engine. The assassins can control bodies. They can destroy documents. They can intimidate witnesses. But they cannot completely control meaning once enough people understand the same pattern. The truth becomes resilient through repetition and verification. That is why journalism becomes the final battlefield. The conspiracy has power because it operates in secrecy. The Post has power because it can destroy secrecy. The struggle between them is therefore not simply political. It is informational. One side wants the truth to remain fragmented. The other wants to connect the fragments. Darby and Gray are dangerous because they are turning isolated facts into a coherent story. By the time Darby and Gray bring the evidence to the Washington Post, the film has transformed the newspaper into something almost as important as the courtroom. The editorial process becomes the final test. Gray cannot simply walk into the newsroom and announce that he has uncovered a massive government corporate conspiracy. The evidence has to survive scrutiny. Editors question sources. Facts are checked. The implications of publication are considered. The scene works because it understands that journalism has its own institutional structure. The difference between rumor and reporting is not certainty. It is verification. The newspaper has to decide whether the evidence is strong enough to withstand retaliation, lawsuits, political pressure, and public skepticism. Darby has already risked everything to reach this point. Now she has to trust another institution. That is a subtle but important development in her character. At the beginning, she believes the law can explain the world. Then she discovers that powerful interests can manipulate the system. By the end, she learns that institutions are not automatically good or bad. Their value depends on the people inside them and the principles they are willing to defend. The Post can fail. It can choose caution over truth. But it can also become the mechanism that makes secrecy impossible. Gray's role is therefore not simply to rescue Darby. He represents a version of institutional courage. The newspaper has resources, lawyers, editors, and a public platform. But those resources only matter if the people controlling them are willing to use them responsibly. When the evidence is finally strong enough, publication becomes inevitable. The conspiracy can no longer be contained. The story reaches the public, and the political consequences begin immediately. The people who seemed untouchable suddenly become vulnerable to investigation. Resignations follow. Allegations become public. The machinery that once protected secrecy begins working in reverse. This reversal is crucial. The same institutions that seemed terrifying earlier now become capable of responding to exposure. The difference is information. Once the truth becomes public, it cannot be managed as easily behind closed doors. The conspiracy depends on secrecy. Journalism destroys secrecy. That does not mean the film believes journalism can fix everything. It simply argues that exposure is one of the few tools available to individuals who lack institutional power. Darby's courage matters because she refuses to let fear determine what can be known. Gray's courage matters because he refuses to publish without proof. Together, they create a chain of accountability. The final consequences are not presented as a complete revolution. There is no fantasy in which every corrupt institution disappears overnight. Instead, specific people are exposed, specific political careers collapse, and the conspiracy loses its ability to operate invisibly. Darby eventually reaches a place where she can breathe again, far from Washington and the machinery that nearly destroyed her. The Caribbean setting gives the ending a strange emotional quality. It is beautiful, but it is not triumphant in the conventional sense. Darby has survived, but survival has changed her. The woman who began the film studying law for intellectual reasons now understands that knowledge has consequences. She has lost Callahan. She has lost her sense of ordinary safety. She has discovered how fragile institutions can be. And yet she has also discovered that one person can begin a chain reaction. The final quietness therefore matters. After so much surveillance, movement, violence, and fear, stillness becomes meaningful. Darby is not celebrating victory. She is experiencing the possibility of an ordinary moment. The conspiracy has been exposed, but the emotional cost remains. That melancholy is part of what separates the Pelican brief from a simple thriller. The film gives us an ending where truth wins, but it does not pretend that truth restores everything that was lost. Darby can survive without returning to the person she was. And perhaps that is the final cost of seeing too clearly. Darby's transformation is one of the most important reasons the film continues to work. At the beginning, she is defined by intellectual confidence. She believes problems can be solved through analysis. Legal systems are structured. Cases have precedents. Arguments can be tested. If something does not make sense, research can uncover the missing connection. That worldview is not naive exactly. It is simply incomplete. Darby has been trained to believe that knowledge creates control. The conspiracy teaches her the opposite. Knowledge can remove control. The more she understands, the less safe she becomes. Her surface goal is therefore to solve a legal puzzle, but her deeper journey is about surviving the consequences of solving it. Callahan's death accelerates that transformation. She does not have time to process grief in the normal way because danger keeps moving toward her. Trauma becomes part of her decision-making. She learns to observe rooms differently. She learns to distrust predictable patterns. She changes her appearance and becomes increasingly conscious of how visible she is. These are not simply plot mechanics. They show the psychological cost of living under surveillance. Darby becomes hypervigilant because the alternative is death. Julia Roberts plays this transformation without turning it into melodrama. Her performance is grounded in restraint. Darby rarely needs to announce that she is terrified. The fear is visible in the way she watches people, pauses before answering, and considers possible exits. Roberts understands that intelligence can be physical. Darby is constantly thinking, and the audience can feel that thought process through her behavior. She is calculating risks even when she is not speaking. That quality allows Roberts to avoid the traditional damsel in distress role. Darby certainly needs help at times. She is not physically dominant, and the film never pretends otherwise. But needing help is not the same as lacking agency. She makes decisions. She follows leads. She recognizes danger. She takes calculated risks. She chooses when to trust Gray. She understands the value of evidence. Most importantly, she never stops thinking. Her intelligence is not a decorative character trait. It is the mechanism through which she survives. This is where the contrast between intellectual strength and physical vulnerability becomes central. A conventional thriller hero might defeat an enemy through force. Darby survives because she notices what others miss. That makes the film's action scenes extensions of her intelligence, rather than replacements for it. When she escapes, the satisfaction comes from knowing that she has outthought someone. Her victories feel earned because the film has established what she can and cannot do. She cannot overpower Kamel. She cannot intimidate government officials. She cannot command the newspaper. But she can recognize patterns, ask the right questions, and refuse to let someone else tell her that what she sees is impossible. Her relationship with Callahan also becomes more complicated after his death. He was the person who validated her intellect, but his decision to circulate the brief indirectly contributes to the danger surrounding her. Darby's grief therefore contains contradiction. She misses him, but she also has to live with the consequences of the information they created together. That emotional conflict gives the story weight beyond its conspiracy mechanics. She is not simply avenging a dead lover. She is trying to understand what his death means. Did he make a mistake by trusting the wrong people? Did he underestimate the system? Did Darby herself create the danger by pushing the theory too far? The film does not reduce these questions to simple answers. Instead, it allows grief and responsibility to coexist. By the end, Darby has become more cautious without becoming cynical. That distinction matters. She has learned that institutions can fail, but she has not concluded that truth is meaningless. She still believes evidence matters. She still believes publication matters. She still believes that exposing corruption is worth the risk. Her growth is therefore not from innocence to nihilism. It is from innocence to informed courage. She learns that doing the right thing does not guarantee safety. Sometimes it guarantees the opposite. But that does not make the choice less valuable. The film's villains are equally interesting because they are not built around a single monstrous personality. Victor Matisse is the shadow at the center of the conspiracy. A powerful oil magnate whose ambitions give the political machinery a financial motive. Yet the film keeps him strangely distant. He is less a traditional villain than an embodiment of concentrated private power. His influence is felt long before he is fully understood. That distance is intentional. The less we see him, the more his power seems to exist everywhere. He does not need to personally threaten Darby in every scene because other people are already acting on his interests. This creates a frightening decentralization of villainy. Matisse wants a development project. Other people want political stability. Others want money. Others want to avoid scandal. The conspiracy emerges from the overlap. Fletcher Cole represents the government side of that overlap. Tony Goldwyn plays him with a cold institutional precision that makes him more disturbing than an openly vicious villain might be. Cole understands power as a system of preservation. When information threatens the administration, his instinct is to contain the information. When a person becomes dangerous, he thinks about neutralizing the person. The morality of the action is secondary to the preservation of the institution. That is what makes him such a strong thematic mirror to Darby. She believes institutions exist to serve principles. Cole believes institutions exist to survive. Those are not the same philosophy. Darby asks whether something is right. Cole asks whether it is manageable. Darby sees individuals. Cole sees risks. Darby believes evidence should change decisions. Cole believes information should be controlled according to political necessity. The conflict between them is therefore larger than a conspiracy. It is a conflict between two ideas of what institutions are for. Kamel occupies a different position. Stanley Tucci's assassin is almost mechanical in his efficiency. He does not need a political ideology. He does not need to believe in the conspiracy. He is a tool. That makes him another extension of the film's argument about institutional violence. The people at the top rarely have to commit violence themselves. They create conditions in which someone else can do it. Kamel's professionalism makes the system visible. Someone has the money to hire him. Someone has information about his targets. Someone provides instructions. Someone benefits when the targets disappear. The physical violence is therefore only the final stage of a much larger process. And that is where the film's moral void becomes clearest. Corporate interests do not have to openly declare war on the law. They only need enough influence to shape who makes the decisions, which regulations survive, and which obstacles disappear. The Supreme Court justices become obstacles because their legal decisions can interfere with private profit. Environmental protection becomes a threat because protected land has economic value. Government becomes a tool because government controls the rules. The conspiracy is therefore built around a frighteningly simple principle. If money can influence the people who interpret the law, then the law can become vulnerable without ever being formally abolished. That is the deeper corruption the Pelican Brief is interested in. The Constitution does not need to disappear. It only needs to be manipulated by people who understand how to work around its intentions. Darby represents the individual trying to restore the connection between law and principle. Matisse and Cole represent the system trying to separate power from accountability. The resulting conflict feels larger than the characters because the characters are expressions of competing institutional philosophies. Gray Grantham provides the film with its moral center because he understands the difference between having information and proving information. Denzel Washington plays him as confident without being reckless, skeptical without being cynical. Gray is not fascinated by Darby's story because it is exciting. He is interested because the evidence might be true. That distinction gives him professional credibility. He knows that journalism can destroy people if done irresponsibly, so he takes verification seriously. His relationship with Darby develops slowly because trust has to be earned. She has been betrayed by people she believed were safe. Gray knows that asking her to trust him is not enough. He has to demonstrate that he is willing to protect the integrity of the story, as well as her life. Their chemistry works precisely because it is not forced into romance. There is attraction in the broad Hollywood sense because both actors are charismatic, but the film does something more interesting with that charisma. It allows two stars to share emotional intimacy without requiring romantic intimacy. Their connection is based on respect. Darby sees in Gray someone who can understand the value of her discovery without exploiting her. Gray sees in Darby a source whose intelligence deserves to be taken seriously. Together, they create a partnership that feels professional first and personal second. That decision also reinforces the film's larger theme. Institutions can fail, but individuals can create new forms of trust. Gray does not have the power of the White House. Darby does not have the power of a corporation. But together they have something the conspiracy fears: credible evidence and a platform capable of making it public. Thomas Callahan, played by Sam Shepard, functions as a tragic mentor figure. He represents the academic world that Darby leaves behind. His belief in her intellect helps launch the investigation, but his death demonstrates the consequences of allowing theoretical knowledge to collide with political power. Gavin Verheek, played by John Hurd, adds another layer to the institutional ecosystem. He represents the possibility that people inside government can still act with integrity, even though the system around them may be compromised. His fate reinforces the film's refusal to make institutions uniformly good or evil. There are individuals inside them trying to do the right thing, and there are individuals using them for personal or political ends. John Lithgow's Smith Presley contributes another form of institutional weight, helping populate the world with characters who understand that information is currency. These supporting performances matter because the Pelican Brief requires a believable Washington. If every character were either a hero or a villain, the conspiracy would become simplistic. Instead, the film fills its world with professionals who have different responsibilities, loyalties, and fears. That creates an oppressive ecosystem in which Darby and Gray are constantly forced to determine who can be trusted. The supporting cast therefore functions almost like architecture. Each character adds another layer to the maze. Callahan connects Darby to the academic world. Verheet connects her to federal law enforcement. Presley connects the story to institutional Washington. Gray connects her to journalism. Mattis connects the conspiracy to corporate power. Cole connects it to executive authority. Kamel connects all of these abstract forces to physical violence. The result is a network rather than a simple villain hierarchy. And that network is precisely what makes the film's paranoia work. Darby cannot simply defeat one person because the danger does not originate from one person. She has to find a way to make the entire structure visible. That is why the eventual publication of the story feels like the true climax. The goal is not to kill the villain. It is to expose the system. At the center of that system is the film's most important idea. Truth is not automatically safe. In many stories, discovering the truth is the beginning of freedom. In the Pelican brief, discovering the truth is the beginning of danger. Darby's knowledge makes her vulnerable because the truth threatens people who possess resources far greater than hers. The film therefore treats information almost like a hazardous commodity. Whoever controls it gains power. Whoever exposes it risks losing power. Whoever possesses it may become a target. This is especially visible in the relationship between corporate ambition and environmental law. The brown pelican is not simply an endangered bird inserted into the plot to create a memorable title. It represents the conflict between economic expansion and the idea that certain things should remain protected, even when they are profitable to exploit. The environmental issue gives the conspiracy a moral dimension, because the people pursuing the development project are not merely chasing money. They are trying to remove a legal obstacle that represents a broader principle. Public interest can place limits on private profit. If the Supreme Court justices stand in the way of that ambition, eliminating them becomes part of the larger strategy. The horror comes from the fact that the corruption does not require anyone to announce that the law no longer matters. Instead, people manipulate the law's machinery until it produces the outcome they want. That is a subtler form of institutional vulnerability. The Constitution remains. The courts remain. The government remains. The problem is that the incentives inside those systems can be distorted. The free press becomes important because it offers a different kind of check. A newspaper cannot arrest a corrupt official or overturn a Supreme Court decision. But it can make secrecy difficult. It can connect facts. It can force questions into public view. That is exactly what Gray and Darby eventually accomplish. They do not destroy the conspiracy through physical strength. They expose it. The film's faith in journalism is therefore cautious rather than naive. The press can make mistakes. Reporters can be manipulated. Editors can become afraid. But when journalism functions properly, it can turn private information into public accountability. That is why Gray's verification process matters so much. The story cannot simply be true in Darby's mind. It must be supported by evidence strong enough to survive institutional resistance. The pursuit of justice also isolates Darby. The more she learns, the less connected she becomes to her old identity. She cannot move freely. She cannot trust easily. She cannot simply return to school and pretend that nothing happened. Her pursuit of truth costs her a sense of normality. This is another way the film complicates the heroic narrative. Justice does not restore innocence. It changes the person who pursues it. Darby wins because she survives and the conspiracy is exposed, but she does not emerge untouched. Her identity has been reshaped by the experience. The film therefore suggests that truth has a price, especially when it challenges institutions powerful enough to defend themselves. Yet it also suggests that the price may be worth paying. If everyone decides that truth is too dangerous to pursue, corruption becomes self-sustaining. The system wins not because it is invincible, but because people become afraid to challenge it. Darby's importance comes from refusing that surrender. She demonstrates that one person's willingness to keep asking questions can eventually connect with another person's willingness to publish answers. The individual cannot defeat institutional power alone, but the individual can begin the chain of accountability. Pakula's visual language makes this argument without needing to explain it. Throughout the Pelican brief, characters are repeatedly framed through windows, glass, doorways, reflections, and architectural divisions. These visual barriers create the impression that everyone is separated from everyone else. Darby may be physically close to another person, while remaining emotionally or informationally isolated. A glass wall can make a character visible but inaccessible. A reflection can show someone without confirming whether they are watching or being watched. A long lens can compress distance until the environment feels strangely flat and threatening. These choices are extensions of Pakula's paranoia style. In his earlier work, space often becomes psychological. A wide environment can feel claustrophobic because the protagonist does not know what is happening beyond the frame. The Pelican brief continues that tradition. Washington's corridors, offices, hotel rooms, parking structures, and government interiors often feel less like neutral locations than controlled spaces. The architecture itself seems to have rules. Darby is always moving through environments built by institutions larger than herself. The cold interiors of Washington contrast with the warmer, more textured spaces of New Orleans, creating a visual distinction between formal power and personal survival. Washington is the city of systems, offices, corridors, government buildings, and controlled access. New Orleans provides movement, color, noise, and unpredictability, yet neither environment is truly safe. The difference is psychological. In Washington, Darby is threatened by institutions. In New Orleans, she is threatened by individuals. The danger changes form but never disappears. The brown pelican provides the film with a symbolic center, because it represents something vulnerable being protected by law against something powerful seeking access to it. The bird becomes a shorthand for environmental preservation, but it also mirrors Darby herself. Both are vulnerable. Both exist within systems that claim to protect them. Both become obstacles to people who believe economic value should override protection. The parallel is not subtle, but it is effective. Darby becomes another endangered thing moving through a landscape dominated by predators. Her changing appearance reinforces that idea. Hair, clothing, disguises, and shifts in presentation become visual markers of her changing relationship with safety. At the beginning, she looks like an ordinary student. As the danger intensifies, appearance becomes strategy. She changes because being recognizable is dangerous. Identity becomes something she has to manage. That creates a fascinating contradiction. The more she tries to survive, the less she can remain herself in public. She must hide her identity to preserve it. This is another reason the film's visual motifs feel connected to its themes. Shadows conceal people. Glass separates people. Reflections distort identity. Disguises conceal identity. Long lenses observe people from a distance. Every visual device relates to the question of who can see whom and who controls what can be seen. Pakula understands that paranoia is fundamentally about visibility. If you know who is watching, you can respond. If you know where the threat is, you can escape. The terrifying situation is when you suspect you are being watched, but cannot identify the watcher. The frame becomes a space of uncertainty. Something may be just outside it. Someone may be observing from a building across the street. A character may be safe for 1 second and exposed the next. The film's visual design keeps reminding us that seeing is not the same as understanding. Darby can see people, but she cannot always know their intentions. Gray can see evidence, but he cannot immediately know whether it is complete. The audience can see the frame, but not the whole conspiracy. That limitation is the foundation of Pakula's visual paranoia. The film's deeper political meaning becomes clearer when placed within the anxieties of the post-Cold War era. The old paranoia of the 1970s had been shaped by fears of government surveillance, political assassination, secret agencies, and institutional betrayal. By 1993, those fears had evolved. The Soviet Union was gone. America was no longer living under the same immediate shadow of nuclear confrontation. Yet suspicion had not disappeared. It had moved inward. The question was no longer simply whether the government might be infiltrated by an external enemy. It was whether domestic institutions could be corrupted by their own incentives. Corporate power becomes the new source of anxiety. Wealth can influence politics without appearing to control it. Lobbying can shape legislation. Campaign interests can affect policy. Private ambition can intersect with public authority. The Pelican brief takes those anxieties and turns them into a conspiracy thriller. Its villains are not foreign agents. They are American institutions and private interests interacting in ways that compromise accountability. That makes the film fundamentally post-Watergate, even though it arrives decades after the scandal. Watergate taught American audiences that institutional authority could conceal wrongdoing. Pakula's film asks what happens when that lesson is combined with enormous corporate wealth and modern media. The answer is a world where public safety can become an illusion. Citizens believe the courts, government, law enforcement, and press exist as separate safeguards. But if enough individuals inside those systems cooperate, the boundaries can blur. The danger is not necessarily one institution controlling everything. The danger is institutions protecting one another. That is why the film's decentralized conspiracy is so important. It suggests that corruption can survive without a single mastermind because people can participate for different reasons. One person wants money. Another wants career security. Another wants political survival. Another simply follows instructions. The result is a machine nobody fully owns and everyone helps operate. Darby's moral position is therefore unusually difficult. She cannot simply prove that one person is evil. She has to reveal a chain of decisions. That raises a philosophical question the film never completely answers. Can systemic corruption ever truly be eradicated? The immediate conspiracy can be exposed. The individuals involved can resign or face investigation. But the incentives that created the corruption remain. Wealth still influences politics. Corporations still seek favorable regulation. Governments still protect themselves. Institutions still contain people with competing motives. Exposure can punish individuals, but it cannot automatically redesign the system. This is where the Pelican brief becomes more pessimistic than its conventional ending might suggest. The story ends with justice apparently restored. But the audience understands that the conditions allowing the conspiracy to exist have not magically vanished. The film's victory is therefore local rather than absolute. Darby and Gray prove that this conspiracy existed. They do not prove that no future conspiracy will exist. The free press can expose corruption, but only when journalists are willing to investigate and editors are willing to publish. The courts can defend principles, but only when judges remain independent. Government can serve the public, but only when officials choose public responsibility over institutional self-preservation. The system works because people make it work. That may be the film's most enduring political idea. Institutions are not inherently virtuous. They are frameworks. Their morality depends on the people operating within them. And when those people decide that protecting the institution is more important than protecting the principle behind it, the framework can become a shield for corruption. Darby's story therefore becomes a warning about passivity. The conspiracy survives because people assume someone else is watching. Someone else will investigate. Someone else will ask questions. Someone else will publish. The film's answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes nobody will. Sometimes the person who discovers the truth has to become the person willing to carry it. And that burden is precisely what Darby inherits.